I never thought I'd be the man standing between a group of German housewives and the consequences of their own cruelty. But that's exactly where I found myself on a cold March morning in 1945, just outside Aschaffenburg, with mud on my boots, orders in my pocket, and a job that no military manual had ever prepared me for. My name is James Walker, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Army, Patton's Command Unit. And what I'm about to tell you is the truest thing I've ever put into words. We'd been rolling through rubble for hours. That's the thing people don't understand about the advance through Germany in the final months of the war. It wasn't clean, it wasn't triumphant. It was slow, grinding, exhausting movement through towns that looked like God had reached down and crumpled them like paper. Half walls standing, chimneys with nothing beneath them. Whole neighborhoods reduced to geometry, the skeleton of what used to be someone's life. And yet people lived in it. That always got me. They swept their steps in the morning. They hung laundry between damaged buildings. They kept doing the small, stubborn, ordinary things that human beings do when the world is falling apart, because routine is the only armor the unarmed have left. I was 2 vehicles behind the general's jeep when it stopped, not a slow roll to a halt, a stop, the kind that happens when one word is said by one man who doesn't need volume to make a room go quiet. Patton had said, "Stop." I climbed out of my vehicle and looked up because everyone was looking up. Through a break in the cold spring clouds, an Allied aircraft was spiraling downward, trailing a dark wound of smoke across the pale sky. The sound reached us before the image fully registered, a low, grinding moan of a dying engine, the kind of sound that once you've heard it, never entirely leaves your ears. But I wasn't looking at the plane for long, because from somewhere close, shockingly, impossibly close, came another sound entirely. Laughter, clapping, the bright, festive noise of people celebrating something wonderful. I turned and saw them. A group of German housewives standing on their porches, some leaning on garden fences with their arms folded, smiling, genuinely smiling. Like their team had just scored a goal, they were cheering for the plane going down, cheering for the young man burning inside it. I stood there for a moment, unable to fully process what I was seeing. Then I heard Patton's boots on the cobblestones, slow, deliberate, the unhurried rhythm of a man with nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. And I watched him do what Patton always did when everyone else was content to drive past something broken. He walked directly toward it. Before I go any further, I need to stop and make you understand something, because I understood it in a way most people back home never had to. The young men flying over Germany in the spring of 1945 were barely old enough to shave. Farm boys from Iowa, kids from Brooklyn, sons of immigrants who'd come to this country with nothing and raised sons who then gave everything. Trained fast, shipped out faster, dropped into an air war that killed with a kind of cold, industrial efficiency that the newspapers back home never quite captured. I had a friend named Danny Kowalski, grew up 2 streets from me in Pittsburgh, wanted to be a mechanic before the war, ended up a tail gunner on a B-17. He told me once, on a leave we shared in London, that the temperature inside those planes at altitude dropped to 40 below zero. Frostbite was routine. Men lost fingers and kept flying because what else were you going to do? Ask the mission to wait. And then came the flak. Anti-aircraft fire that didn't announce itself. 1 second the sky was empty. The next, it was full of black shrapnel bursts, capable of tearing through the thin aluminum skin of a bomber like a fist through paper, capable of tearing through the man inside just as easily. Danny didn't come back from his 23rd mission. I thought about Danny every time I heard a plane go down. The women cheering on those porches had no idea what those boys went through to get to that sky above their street. They'd been told those young men were monsters, terrorflieger, terror flyers, not soldiers doing their duty, not kids who wanted nothing more than to go home, murderers, savages, people whose suffering was something to be celebrated rather than mourned. And I'm telling you honestly, as a man who was there, standing on those wet cobblestones with the smell of burning fuel beginning to reach us from the fields at the edge of town, standing there watching those women clap, I felt something dark move through me, not just anger, something older than anger, something that wanted to be contempt and almost got there. But Patton was already walking. And when Patton walked towards something, you watched closely, because you were going to learn something about how to be a human being, whether you were ready to or not. He crossed the street slowly. That detail matters. I want you to feel it. Not running, not charging, not performing outrage for the benefit of the men watching. Slowly. Each step deliberate, measured, the heavy clap of polished cavalry boots on wet cobblestones echoing off what remained of the walls around us. 4 silver stars on his helmet, catching the pale grey light, his hands at his sides, nowhere near the revolvers. He didn't need them. The women saw him coming, and the laughter stopped. Not gradually, the way a sound fades. It just stopped, like someone cutting a wire. One moment they were clapping, the next they were frozen, and the silence was so complete I could hear the wind. I was close enough to see their faces change. First, the laughter died. Then came confusion, then recognition, the slow, dawning, stomach-dropping kind, as they understood exactly who was walking toward them in the flat grey March light. The commander of the United States Third Army, the man whose tanks were currently dismantling German infrastructure like a hammer through glass, walking toward them, unhurried, Arctic calm. He spoke through our military interpreter, and I was standing close enough to hear every word. He asked them what was funny, not sarcastically, genuinely. What exactly did they find amusing about a young man falling from the sky? He pointed one leather-gloved finger upward toward the dark trail of smoke still hanging in the cold air like a scar, held it there long enough for every woman on that street to look at it, then turned that same finger slowly toward them. He told them who that young man was dying for. He stripped away a decade of propaganda in plain, brutal, unhurried sentences. He told them that the boys in those planes, the boys they were laughing at, were the direct reason they would be alive in 6 months. That it was those kids, taking that flak, burning in those cockpits, falling through freezing air over enemy territory, who were going to hand them back a future worth having. Then he asked them, still calm, never once raising his voice, how they planned to look American soldiers in the face when those same soldiers came to hand out food rations, bring medicine, stand between those women and the Soviet army pressing in hard from the east. Were they planning to laugh at those soldiers too? Or was the laughing only for when the boys were helpless and on fire? Nobody answered. Nobody could look at him. The cobblestones became the most interesting things in the world. Women who had been clapping 60 seconds ago were now staring at the ground with the specific, nauseated expression of people confronting something about themselves they can never fully unknow. I've seen men break under artillery fire. I've seen soldiers fall apart at things the human mind was never built to absorb, but I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like watching Patton strip a crowd of their comfortable cruelty using nothing but the truth, delivered without apology, aimed with the precision of a man who spent 30 years learning exactly where words hit deepest. Then he turned to me. I remember the exact moment, the grey eyes landing on mine, the brief pause. Walker, sir, gather them, all of them, the ones who were cheering and the ones who stood there and said nothing, because silence has its own answer. Treat every one of them with complete respect, no roughness, no cruelty. He paused. Take them to the crash site. He said it the way you'd say, pass me the map. Quiet, absolute. Then he walked back to his jeep, climbed in, and the column began to move. And I was left standing on that street with a group of German housewives and an order that I understood immediately and completely, even though no training in the world had ever prepared me for it. This was not punishment. Patton had been very clear about that with his eyes even before his words. Complete respect, no cruelty. This was something else, something that required more precision than punishment and would last considerably longer. He was going to make them smell it, because war from a porch is an abstraction. It's visual, safely distant. It doesn't reach through your nose or your hands or the soles of your feet. You can cheer for it the same way you'd cheer for something on a stage, because there's enough space between you and it to keep it from being entirely real. Patton understood, in a way that only people who have spent years inside the physical reality of combat can understand, that real understanding doesn't live in the mind. It lives in the body, and the body needed to be present at the thing it had just celebrated. I organized them quietly. My German was basic, but the interpreter helped, and honestly, the women didn't need much explanation. They understood what was happening. You could see it in the way they moved. Not defiant anymore, not celebratory, just quiet. The way people get when they know they've been caught by something they can't argue with. We walked through the fields at the edge of town. Cold, dark, churned mud that sucked at shoes and soaked through stockings and smelled like iron and old earth and something less nameable, something that belongs to places where violence has recently occurred and hasn't yet been cleaned away. The crash site was a 10-minute walk. The smell hit us before we reached it. Aviation fuel has a particular smell, thick, chemical, almost sweet in a way that is immediately and completely wrong. Mixed with scorched earth, scorched metal, the smell of something that was built to fly being brought violently to ground. Some of the women put their hands over their mouths, not performing, just reacting, the way any human being reacts when the nose delivers information the mind wasn't prepared for. I gave the order Patton had given me. Clear debris. Carefully, respectfully fold the deployed parachute, that heavy canvas the pilot had trusted with his life, and set it aside properly. Help secure the area. Work in silence. They worked. They got down on their knees in that mud, and they worked with their hands in the fuel-soaked earth. Nobody spoke above what was absolutely necessary. The only sounds were the wind, the distant rumble of artillery further east, and the quiet, wet sounds of people working in a field that smelled like the end of something. I watched a woman who had been clapping 30 minutes ago kneel in the mud and begin carefully gathering the folds of a parachute with her bare hands. Her fingers were shaking, not from cold. And then she wept. Not the kind of weeping someone does because they think it's expected, because they know they're being watched and they want to demonstrate something. The kind that rises from somewhere below the conscious mind. The kind your body produces when it has finally been handed enough physical truth to override what the brain spent years being told to believe. One by one, quietly, without drama, without theatrics, they broke. Not all of them. I won't tell you it was a perfect, cinematic moment of universal redemption, because that's not what happened, and I won't insult your intelligence with a clean story. Some of them rebuilt their walls around the experience before we even got back to town. I could see it happening in certain faces, the slow construction of distance, the retreat back behind the comfortable partition of we were scared, we were confused, we didn't know. But some of them wouldn't. Some of them would smell aviation fuel for the rest of their lives and know, in the deepest and most physical way a person can know anything, exactly what they had been clapping for. That's what Patton was after, not the performance. The knowing, the permanent body-level knowing that no amount of carefully constructed internal revisionism can ever entirely erase. I've been asked, in the years since the war ended, what the hardest moment of my service was. People expect me to name a battle, a firefight, a moment of incoming artillery or a bridge taken under fire, and those things were hard in the way that physical danger is hard, immediate, terrifying, demanding every reflex you have, and several you didn't know were there. But the hardest thing I ever did in uniform was walk a group of ordinary women through mud to a crash site and watch them understand what they'd done. Because the battlefield is clean in a way that nothing else is. The enemy is in front of you. The objective is clear. The moral arithmetic, however brutal, is simple. You are trying to survive. They are trying to stop you. What Patton asked me to do that morning had no simple arithmetic. It was murky and human and deeply uncomfortable in a way that war, paradoxically, often isn't. He was asking me to hold space for the complexity of ordinary people who had done a terrible thing without being monsters. People who had been carefully, patiently, systematically taught to celebrate cruelty until it felt like patriotism. He was asking me to be present for the moment the teaching fell apart, and he was asking me to do it with respect, complete respect, no cruelty, no revenge. Because revenge would have been easy, and easy things don't leave marks that last. The easiest thing in the world for a man like Patton in the spring of 1945 would have been to look at those cheering women and feel nothing but contempt, write them off, see them as exactly what they looked like in that moment, small, cruel, complicit, and drive past. He had a war to finish. He had 3 armies to coordinate, a Rhine to cross, a Germany to dismantle. Nobody would have blamed him for keeping his eyes forward. Nobody would have noticed if he'd driven past. He stopped. He stopped because he understood something about war that gets buried under battle maps and casualty figures and sweeping historical narratives. He understood that the military victory was only half of it. That what determined whether all those deaths, all those Danny Kowalskis, all those farm boys from Iowa, all those kids from Brooklyn who wanted to go home, whether any of it meant anything was whether the people living in the rubble of Europe could reconnect with their own humanity. You can win a war and lose the peace. History is full of proof. You defeat an enemy, you occupy a country, you sign papers, and 20 years later, the same hatred has rebuilt itself from the same materials because nobody made anyone stand in the mud and smell what hatred actually produces. Patton was a general. He thought in terms of what comes next. And what comes next, after the shooting stops, is people. Ordinary people who have to decide every morning whether they are going to be capable of living alongside the people they spent years being told to hate. He understood that morning in Aschaffenburg that if those women drove back to wherever they were before the war, carrying intact their capacity to cheer for burning young men, then everything his soldiers had bled for was built on sand. So he stopped. He walked toward it. He made everybody stand in the mud and understand exactly what they'd been clapping for. Not because he was soft, because he was hard enough to do the thing that actually mattered instead of the thing that felt satisfying. I think about that street sometimes, standing here at the far end of a long life. I think about how easy it was for those women to cheer, how natural it felt to them, how the laughter came without hesitation, without a flicker of internal resistance, because 12 years of patient dripping propaganda had quietly dissolved the part of them that might have said, wait, there's a human being in that plane. And I think about how close that is to things I see every day now. We live in a world where it has never been easier to celebrate the misfortune of someone you've been told is your enemy. You don't need to be standing on a porch in Germany in 1945. You just need a screen and an algorithm and a community of people who share your particular flavor of carefully cultivated anger. The mechanics are the same. The dripping is the same. The gradual, comfortable dissolution of the part of you that says wait is the same. The plane going down just looks different. And the question Patton asked those women, calmly, precisely, without apology, is the same question available to all of us every single time we feel the crowd begin to clap. What exactly do you think is funny about this? Who is in that plane? And what have you been taught to believe about them that allows you to stand here and smile? Patton stopped the jeep. He walked toward the thing everyone else was content to cheer at from a comfortable distance. He demanded, quietly, coldly, with the full weight of everything he'd seen and carried for 30 years, that people look at what they'd done. He sent me to make sure they felt it. I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of that order. Not the cruelty, Never the cruelty, the respect, the insistence that even the people who have done a terrible thing remain human beings who are capable of knowing better if someone is willing to stand in the mud with them long enough to make the knowing real. That's the hardest kind of leadership there is, and it's the only kind that lasts. If this story found something in you, if it made you think differently about how hatred is built and how decency can be demanded back, pass it forward. These stories don't surface on their own. They have to be carried, one person at a time, until they reach the person who needed to hear them. My name is James Walker. I was there. Thank you for watching. If you're drawn to powerful, untold war stories and the hidden moments behind history's most intense decisions, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these gripping stories to life. Tell us in the comments. If you had been there when Patton gave that order, what would you have done? And how do you think civilians should be treated in times of war when emotions run high? See you in the next story.